Welcome to some very famous people you've never really heard of. Bite-sized biographies of the famous, the infamous, and the quirky in less than an hour. My name is Philip D. Gibbons, and there is more information about me, this podcast, and a bibliography at someveryfamouspeople.com. There are also photographs of many of the individuals and items mentioned in this podcast. At the conclusion of part 2 of this presentation, there will be additional suggestions concerning further information about today's subject, J.D. Salinger. If you have enjoyed this presentation, please like us at our Facebook page, Some Very Famous People. Follow us on Twitter at Philip D. Gibbons. Subscribe to my YouTube page at Noblesse Oblige. Please note that all of Bite-sized biographies are now available on YouTube, YouTube Music, Spotify, and please tell a friend about Bite-sized biographies. Now let's continue with our story about J.D. Salinger. Salinger must have felt optimistic about the book's success, but the critical response probably was personally unexpected. The New York Times called it unusually brilliant. The Saturday Review, remarkable and absorbing. The New Yorker, funny and brilliant. The San Francisco Chronicle, literature of a very high order, and so on around the nation. Of course, there were naysayers like the Catholic World and the Christian Science Monitor who called the language repellent and vulgar, and some critics focused on use of the F word spelled out, unthinkable in 1951 popular American fiction. This probably only served to increase the book's profile and popularity, propelling it onto the New York Times bestseller list, where it stayed for 7 months. Salinger did not follow the publicity norms of the day, chatting up columnists and splashing his name throughout what was a much smaller media environment. He granted only one interview, which accompanied the Book of the Month Club presentation as a favor to the piece's author, New Yorker editor and friend William Maxwell. Even this very brief interaction proved troubling to Salinger. In it is mentioned that Salinger lived in Stamford, Connecticut, with his schnauzer Benny, a revelation that prompted Salinger to never return to that residence again. By the third printing of the book, he demanded that Little Brown remove his large portrait that appeared on the back of the book's dust jacket. His obsession with the idea that photos would allow for his public recognition prompted him to refuse and avoid photography of any kind. But despite these and other later attempts to stifle the celebrity that would ensue after the success and contents of such a book, Salinger was unsuccessful. His inclusion and capture of Holden's words concerning a good book that you wish the author that wrote it was a terrific friend of yours and you could call him up on the phone whenever you like it was an unfortunate inclusion for an individual who wanted no part of those who decided that this was actually Salinger's personal invitation. Salinger left Connecticut for an apartment on Manhattan's Sutton Place, selected by his agent while he was in Britain. Described as sparsely furnished, cell-like, and depressing, it was not the cheerful residence of a blossoming literary superstar. News that British critics had mostly trashed A Catcher in the Rye and that sales were minimal upset him, as he was hoping Jamie Hamilton, who had been so good to him, would enjoy the same largesse as Little Brown. He also became obsessed with all of his reviews in general, even the most positive ones, feeling that they were glib and didn't really get the essence of the book. Salinger's personal turmoil was evidenced by his lack of any literary production during 1951. He spent much of this year working on a short story entitled De Daumier Smith's Blue Period, which despite numerous back and forths with the New Yorker editorial staff was ultimately rejected. Jamie Hamilton then stepped in and got it published in the British periodical World Review. This, the last non-New Yorker and exclusively international piece Salinger ever published. The death of Harold Ross, the legendary publisher of The New Yorker, was also a development that added additional uncertainty to the author's life. When Salinger's dislike of New York City began to border on the neurotic, he became reclusive, fearing that he would be recognized if he ventured out in public. He longed for true solitude, and in late 1952, he resolved to actually find it. With his sister Doris, he set out on a road trip, immediately ruling out anything that was remotely suburban. Coastal northern Massachusetts appealed to him, but unsure of how profitable Ketcher would remain, Salinger felt the area was too expensive. He pressed on to rural Vermont and found the former artist colony that was Cornish, New Hampshire, just over the border, former home to such luminaries as Maxfield Parrish. A real estate broker took him to the ex-residence of the sculptor, Augustus Saint-Gaudens, in fact still owned by the artist's daughter. The building was in dreadful shape, had no running water, no indoor plumbing, and no heat of any kind, but it did have 90 acres of land in one of the most bucolically scenic regions in the United States, and while close to New York, extremely rural and remote. To the surprise of his sister, and despite the still hefty price, Salinger agreed to buy the property, just like Holden Caulfield, who dreams of buying a Vermont cabin near a river and never having to have a conversation with anyone ever again. In February 1953, Salinger occupied his New Hampshire property, chopping wood, fetching water from a nearby stream, and renovating his house, invigorating him to the point where he shed the doldrums of 1952 and even attempted to interact with some of the local inhabitants. Cornish itself was tiny. It didn't even have a central Main Street-style shopping district. So to even encounter locals, Salinger made his way across the traditional covered bridge that spanned the Connecticut River and connected the New Hampshire side with the nearby town of Windsor, Vermont. There he could handle correspondence through the local post office and hang out in a handful of diners and luncheonettes frequented by the town's inhabitants. Although 34, Salinger seemed to bond mostly with the town's local high school students, buying them food, having long discussions, driving them around in his Jeep, a relic of Salinger's New England house hunting sojourn. He would even take groups of students back to his house for even longer interactions, playing records and drinking soda. Local parents felt comfortable enough to allow him to head up a local church youth group, and by all accounts, he was completely sincere and honorable in his dealings with these young people. Salinger also hosted cocktail parties and proudly demonstrated the renovations on his house to many of his adult neighbors, who he treated in a friendly, down-to-earth manner. It is possible that this entire interaction was an attempt to again escape the process of interacting with the various business aspects of both the paperback edition of A Catcher in the Rye and the collection of short stories that had been in the works as a concept for many years. Salinger was already disappointed by a predictably problematic interaction with his British publisher, Jamie Hamilton. As a further exploration of Eastern spirituality, Salinger began to study a form of Hinduism known as Vedanta. One of the books that Salinger read and studied during this process was called The Gospels of Sri Ramakrishna, a recitation of the conversations between a Bengali holy man, Sri Ramakrishna, and his acolytes. Originally published in India, the book was brought to the U.S. by a Hindu philosopher and a teacher of Vedanta concepts named Swami Vivekananda. Salinger became intensely interested in Vedanta as an extension of his analysis of Zen Buddhism. He recommended the Gospels of Sri Ramakrishna to Jamie Hamilton as the religious book of the century, enthusiastically sending his publisher a copy, further recommending that Hamilton publish it in Great Britain. When Hamilton received the massive, practically inscrutable text, he was completely taken aback. Not only could he barely comprehend it, he understood immediately that the Gospels were devoid of any commercial potential of any kind. At first he attempted to sidestep any mention of the book or his reaction, until Salinger pointedly asked him about it. He acknowledged receiving it, even having read it, but on a personal basis he admitted that he was at a loss as to what it meant, and also added, possibly speciously, that another publisher was already considering publishing a version of the book. Salinger acknowledged this reaction and outwardly dropped the topic, but as always, he was irritated that his close associate was relatively uninterested in what for him was now an all-consuming philosophy. This irritation manifested itself in typical Salinger behavior surrounding the publication of the author's collection of short stories. By now, both of his publishers were wary of involving themselves in any dispute with the author based on both his intransigence and perfectionism. Instead of the typical title involving at least the mention of one of the stories in the title, Hamilton wanted something like For Esme with Love and Squalor and Other Stories. Salinger simply wanted 9 stories, an unheard of approach in publishing, and he insisted on it with the rationale that he did not want any one story to be emphasized. Any attempt by Hamilton to discuss the commercially negative aspects of such a title were dismissed. Little Brown did not even bother to argue, deferring to a very simple cover with no design other than titles and no photo or biographical information on the cover. The collection would also include Salinger's most recent New Yorker story, Teddy, a violent and disturbing piece with a shocking ending. It also contained preachy elements of Salinger's spiritual bent, but the new executive editors at the New Yorker, William Shawn and Gus Lebrano, were also reluctant to take on their biggest literary star. Reader reaction was just as emphatic as for Esme with Love and Squalor, but this time it was decidedly negative and even outraged. Both the paperback version of A Catcher in the Rye and 9 stories were released in rapid succession with a predictable result. The short story collection was greeted positively, but also with a sense that it did not live up to the standards set by Salinger in A Catcher in the Rye. The book was eventually also released in Great Britain, again to both a lukewarm reception and tepid sales. Surprisingly, Salinger had finally agreed to allow the title For Esme with Love and Squalor and Other Stories, but it made little difference to a still unimpressed British public. In the U.S., public response was much different, the book hitting the bestseller list for 3 months, unheard of for a collection of short stories. As far as Salinger's reaction to this round of critical analysis, he did not have one, telling his agent and New Yorker editors expressly not to send him any reviews of the collection. Salinger's initial New England idyll would rapidly deteriorate as a result of one external and another local relationship. Salinger's romantic endeavors had frequently been furtive and briefly inchoate, conducted from long distances and via letters. He also seems to have had an attraction to extremely young, even adolescent women. In 1951, at one of the numerous New York cocktail parties that Salinger was frequently invited to, he met a 16-year-old girl named Claire Douglas. Claire was the daughter of a respected British art critic and dealer, Robert Langton Douglas. Despite the 16-year age difference, Salinger was intrigued. He followed up with his hosts and got Claire's particulars, the girl young enough to still be attending prep school in the New York City area. This began what for Salinger was a pattern of interaction with females. He kept in touch with Claire, but eventually she distanced herself until 4 years later while she was attending Radcliffe. The relationship was rekindled, and in 1953 she was making regular trips to Cornish. Eventually, Salinger told her that he loved her and asked her to leave school and move in with him. Although somewhat dominated by Salinger's considerable personality, Claire refused, wanting to finish college. Apparently, Salinger did not take this refusal well, and for the first time, his selfish insensitivity was revealed. Not only did Claire leave, she traveled to Europe in the summer of 1953 with another man, a Harvard MBA named Coleman Mockler, Jr. When she returned, Salinger would not allow her to visit, deeply upset by her previous refusals. In November, Salinger's neurotic privacy issues instigated another incident which permanently affected his attitudes towards his immediate environment. Among the students at Windsor High School, Salinger was especially close to a senior named Shirley Blaney. Shirley asked if she could interview him for what she described as a school project. Salinger readily agreed after specifically confirming that this was merely a school assignment that would not be transmitted publicly. They met very informally at a Windsor luncheonette, and Salinger answered her questions, most of them quite general and not information that could not be gleaned from even the interview provided by the Book of the Month Club. But the article was not a high school project. wound up a few days later in the local newspaper, the Claremont Eagle-Times. Not only was the method of access gained through deceit, the article itself contained errors that would have especially incited Salinger. It stated that he was currently involved in a movie production, that he only attended New York University, and got his military service time wrong by subtracting 2 years. Salinger, who certainly brooded over the incident, was probably even more upset with whatever adult had colluded with Shirley to exploit what he thought was an innocent and special relationship. To the writer, it also brought the dispiriting realization that even here, in the rustic woods of New England, among a tiny community far away from the cynicism and mercantilism of Manhattan, he still would be subjected to such an invasive betrayal. He had a very predictable reaction. His visits to the town greatly diminished, and his interaction not only with high school students, but the adults of the region also were completely terminated. To the few students who did attempt to visit his home, he refused to come to the door, even feigning that he wasn't home. The community, like several individuals in his life, would now learn that when J.D. Salinger was done with you, that door was closed forever. Life went on, and with its circumstances that changed Salinger's attitudes towards Claire Douglas. Early in 1954, she became seriously ill, so ill that she was hospitalized and required surgery. Her then boyfriend, Mockler, remained totally devoted to her during this time period and ultimately asked her to marry him, and she agreed. Shortly afterward, Mockler underwent a religious transformation involving fundamentalist Christianity. At some point, Salinger renewed his connection with Claire, who had never really gotten over him, and this time he was able to convince her to annul her marriage and move in with him at his home in Cornish. She was 4 months shy of her Radcliffe graduation. They were married on February 17, 1955. Although Salinger published nothing new in 1954, he was working on an extended short story entitled Franny that clearly invoked autobiographical aspects of his wife and even his wife's first husband. It also contains spiritual aspects that the main character, Franny, a college student, is attempting to utilize to break out of her currently shallow and meaningless existence. This work was so entwined with Salinger's wife that he gave her the original manuscript as a wedding present. Its publication on January 29, 1955, received a great deal of both critical and popular attention. The story well received and endlessly analyzed, the material so enigmatic, different theories developed over what had actually happened. Salinger and his wife's spiritual quest seemed to also continue in their daily life in Cornish. He decided that they would become self-sufficient and plant a vegetable garden. Their house also still relied on well water. As Salinger immersed himself in his Vedantic faith, Claire almost immediately became pregnant. The initial joy of their relationship unfortunately faded into unhappiness as typically Salinger withdrew from his wife, not only sexually but even geographically, leaving her, heavily pregnant, to fend for herself as winter set in. For several trips to New York City, where he spent time writing while at the offices of the New Yorker. Claire was so outwardly miserable and candid about disliking her lonely and meager existence in New Hampshire that her upscale relatives began sending her clothes and care packages, not understanding that her husband was generating immense sums via his writing career. On December 10, 1955, the Salinger's first child, named Margaret, was born. Even this involved a personal struggle, Salinger wanting to name the girl Phoebe after Holden's sister in A Catcher in the Rye. Although both spouses greatly anticipated becoming parents, even their physical location and environment would have made raising an infant difficult. A hospital was over 20 miles away in Hanover, New Hampshire. They were holed up in a cabin without any running water in the dead of winter with a baby that suffered the typical ailments of a newborn. With an increasingly unhappy wife and frequently caterwauling infant, Salinger's solution was utterly predictable. He built what has been described as a bunker, but what was really a concrete and cinder block enclosure with a bed, long writing table, his typewriter, and a wood-burning stove. And this wasn't some infrequent refuge. After breakfast, Salinger would head to this man cave and stay there for at least 12 hours. Sometimes he would sleep there, and he made it very clear that he was not to be disturbed. For Claire Salinger, it must have been a rough winter. but the spring brought a healthier child, indoor plumbing, and even a washing machine. Unfortunately, this uptick in the marriage didn't last. In the winter of 1957, Salinger, his wife, and child made a rare visit to New York City together to meet Jamie Hamilton and his wife. Perhaps having already conceived of such a plan, or possibly swayed by the reintroduction of the comforts of urban life away from barren, frozen New England and dreading a return to Cornish, Claire waited until her husband left their hotel and then fled to an undisclosed location. Her daughter later stated that her mother confided that she had planned to murder her and then commit suicide, but instead she just ran away. Salinger was so self-absorbed, he returned to Cornish by himself and spent months on his next story, Zoe. This was another installment in his ongoing saga of the Glass family, gifted but quirky siblings, to say the least. When he finished it, he came back to New York in May and tracked down his wife, who was staying in an apartment paid for by her parents. Salinger was able to patch things up, but only as a result of agreeing to a laundry list of life and structural improvements to the marriage, including Claire's ability to travel away from Cornish in the wintertime to some other warmer clime whenever she chose. Salinger did make good on his commitment to spending more time with his family and bringing their residence into the 20th century, but he remained obsessed with his work and promised lengthy trips to Europe never materialized. Eventually, Salinger's cinder-block writing sanctuary proved insufficient for him to provide the solitude he needed to finish his work. He again began to take trips to places like Atlantic City, New Jersey, holing up in hotel rooms, typically failing to get much done. This compulsion was also enabled by the New Yorker staff, who considered him their superstar and no longer even edited his work, merely publishing it as to avoid any antagonism. Salinger's Glass series continued with the New Yorker's publication of Raise High the Roof Beams, Carpenters, and Seymour in 1955 and 1959, respectively. These Glass series of 4 short but actually quite lengthy stories were released in 2 separate books in 1961 and 1963. They continued to incorporate aspects of Salinger's spiritual outlook, but in a manner that was more pronounced to the point of proselytizing. No matter, the series remained popular with most critics and the reading public. Franny and Zoe would hit #1 on the Times bestseller list, a distinction A Catcher in the Rye never achieved. There was also an uptick in Salinger's domestic life with the birth of his son, Matthew, on February 13th, 1960. However, another close member of the Salinger entourage was about to feel his wrath and perpetual banishment. In 1958, Jamie Hamilton had sold the rights to produce a paperback version of For Esme with Love and Squalor to the British publisher Harborough Publishing and its paperback imprint, Ace Books. Hamish Hamilton's typical publisher for such an effort, Penguin Books, which had published A Catcher in the Rye, passed, not surprisingly, as Salinger's British sales continued to be sluggish. Ace Books was a typical publisher of pulpy dime store novels that featured provocative, practically comic book-style cover art, and for this edition, they outdid themselves in the worst possible way. The cover of a piece, which was about, among other things, the lovely qualities of an innocent young girl, featured a caricature of a much older bombshell blonde, crowned with a garish subtitle, A Painful and Pitiable Gallery of Men, Women, Adolescents, and Children. Jamie Hamilton had not wanted Salinger to know anything about this book and never sent him a copy, fully understanding how he would react. But eventually Salinger acquired the book on his own. Again, Salinger felt terribly betrayed, not only by what he considered the degradation of his work, but by Hamilton's duplicity in an effort to squeeze out a buck. Salinger held both Hamilton and his publishing house in very high esteem, much more so than Little Brown, who he detested. But again, after a very pointed conversation and a rejection of not only any other employee of Hamish Hamilton, but even Hamilton's wife, a formerly close friend, Salinger permanently severed this relationship. Through his agent, he even told Hamish Hamilton that despite their right of first refusal, he would go unpublished in Great Britain rather than allow any access to his future efforts. If Salinger's behavior seemed inappropriately strident, his attitudes became more intelligible as a result of how American media attempted to penetrate the aura of mystery that surrounded one of the most beguiling literary figures of the era. Such publications as Time, Newsweek, Life, and various others not only sent correspondents to the Windsor Cornish area, they sent photographers intent on photographing Salinger as the biggest of celebrity big game. Salinger's encounters with such individuals only intensified his adamant refusal to cooperate with any formal media. And then the hate mail and crazies started to come out of the woodwork, and for someone as already as antsy as Salinger, this was especially disconcerting. Finding complete strangers, obsessive pilgrims from all over the world, loitering in his driveway became a frequent occurrence. Still, Salinger pressed on. If any of the locals had been put off by his determined standoffishness, he regained their fierce loyalty by buying an adjoining farm when it came up for sale, as it became publicly known that a prospective buyer meant to transform the extensive acreage into a trailer park. Despite the obviously absurdist appeal of such a development, this was all Salinger had to hear to spring into action. His neighbors, with nowhere near the economic resources, were grateful for his deliverance from this project, and although traditionally courteous to visitors, any inquiries to locals about the location of Salinger's remote residence were greeted with only the advisory that the Salingers didn't really welcome uninvited guests. In fact, it became a local sport to give directions to some of the incorrectly remotest parts of the county. Journalists were ignored entirely. Hapworth 16, 1924, was Salinger's last publication in the New Yorker, appearing in the June 19, 1965 issue, another addition to the Glass anthology. As usual, editor William Shawn did not know what to make of it. Neither did the other editors, but again, Salinger was treated with complete deference, as the author's wildly successful previous efforts had also initially been met with some editorial skepticism. This time, Salinger's amazing run came to a screeching halt. It wasn't so much that the story was mediocre, it was unreadable, reviewers unable to even complete it. It was such a dud that critics didn't even bother with scathing criticism. One rare review did sum it up by saying that Salinger must have gotten exactly the solitude he wanted, as he was now writing for an audience of one, himself. Thus ended J.D. Salinger's literary career, at least his public career. But it was not the end of Salinger's status as an American popular culture icon. In fact, that process was only in its initial stages. Not surprisingly, shortly after the publication of Hapworth, Claire and Salinger separated. This after a doctor examining Claire Salinger told her, after hearing of her various ailments concerning loss of weight, sleeplessness, and tension, that she was merely suffering from a terrible marriage. Her official complaint maintained that her husband refused to communicate with her for long periods of time, and his indifference was injuring her health and endangering her reason. Even Salinger probably couldn't disagree with that. He deliberately didn't fight too hard when Claire was awarded the couple's original home and the 90 acres that came with it. He was in the process of building his own house on his new land up the street in anticipation, and he was afraid if Claire had no Cornish roots, she would take the kids out of the area. This actually worked. The former Salinger couple, actually for a while neighbors, as opposed to being married. Whether it was the stinging rejection of Hapworth, the realization that he could never duplicate something like A Catcher in the Rye, or simply a stubborn determination to do everything possible to limit the intrusive demands of the outside world, it became clear by the late 60s that J.D. Salinger had no intention of publishing anything publicly ever again. In 1972, he paid back in advance for his next book from Little Brown and Company of $75,000 with interest. His life began to be transformed into a never-ending battle to control and destroy any material that could be exploited about his past life. When the University of Texas was able to purchase numerous letters of his to Elizabeth Murray, he legally attempted to limit public access and instructed family, close friends, New Yorker staff, and even his agent to destroy any letters from him, which they did, eliminating whole periods of invaluable material. In 1974, he was so enraged by a pirated copy anthology of his early short stories that he made the ultimate sacrifice in an effort to stop this illegal intrusion. He gave a 30-minute interview to a reporter from the New York Times decrying what he called an illicit act. Suppose you had a coat you liked and somebody went into your closet and stole it. That's how I feel. Probably of greater interest was his statement, I write just for myself and my own pleasure. Salinger's broadside to the underground publishers and bookstores that were marketing this material got the message. The anthology disappeared. The shady individual who had approached various large bookstores with copies was never heard from again. But Salinger emerged from this incident perceived as an odd and peevish character, and some began to wonder if his whole insistence on privacy was contrived. Who calls up the New York Times knowing that doing so will result in his presence on the front page, which ultimately happened? In that same year, both of his parents passed away, adding to his personal isolation. As the 80s began and Salinger's actual publishing career faded, only the popular culture recluse image, made more luridly sensational by a Catcher-in-the-Rye's obscene connection to both the assassination of John Lennon and attempted assassination of Ronald Reagan, became stronger, and Salinger became even more deeply neurotic about the outside world. The ritual of his agent sorting through his mail and forwarding only correspondence she felt important, even this the writer found impossible to even open. Mail piling up for weeks at a time, friends and even family unable to communicate with him. In 1986, Salinger again emerged to engage in lengthy litigation over a biography, this time with writer Ian Hamilton. This famous court case would drag on for several expensive years in which Salinger was forced to come to New York for a deposition. And although he ultimately prevailed in stopping the writer and using or even paraphrasing many of Salinger's letters now reposing in college archives, Hamilton merely incorporated his legal experience into the book, which eventually received a great deal more attention, as opposed to Salinger merely ignoring it. Although Hamilton later underlined his frustration with dealing with such a peculiar subject by stating when asked if he would write another biography, only if the subject has been dead for at least 100 years. J.D. Salinger would continue this isolated existence until January 27, 2010, when he died at the age of 91. By then his public image had taken some solid hits, most notably when the writer Joyce Maynard recounted Salinger's seduction of her when she was an 18-year-old Yale freshman. Maynard was something of a publishing prodigy, having written an article in the April 23, 1972 issue of the New York Times Magazine. Within days, she received a very solicitous and complimentary letter from Salinger, which resulted in a lengthy correspondence. Some of these letters eventually revealed to the public. In these letters, Salinger, 53 years old, eventually professed his love for Maynard in a style befitting a high school sophomore. This correspondence had the desired effect. In a pattern similar to the author's seduction of his second wife, he successfully convinced Maynard to drop out of Yale, give up her scholarship, and move in with him in Cornish. This relationship lasted 9 months, ending in a Florida vacation with Salinger's 2 children, ostensibly when Salinger told her he did not wish to have any more children, merely a pretext for a bored man 35 years her senior to discard her and move on. On a Florida beach, he literally told her she needed to leave. Maynard, without any money or credit card, had to call her mother to buy her an airplane ticket. The next morning, Salinger gave her 2 $50 bills and put her in a cab to the airport. She bought a house in New Hampshire and, still hoping to at least maintain something of a relationship, continued to phone Salinger over the course of the next few months. Eventually, he told her abruptly, "Stop calling me. I have nothing to say to you." This interaction remained mostly unknown until the late 90s, when Maynard spilled the tea in a memoir that was extremely negative and especially emphasized again by Maynard's comments in 2021 at the height of the Me Too movement. "I was groomed to be the sexual partner of a narcissist who nearly derailed my life. When he sent me away less than a year later with words of contempt and disdain, I believed the failure was mine and that I was no longer worthy of his love or even respect." Since they really couldn't defend Salinger's conduct, many within the critical and literary community attacked Maynard for attempting to cash in on the entire incident. Maynard also auctioned off her Salinger letters at about the same time for a considerable sum, which only added to her vilification. But any image of Salinger as the sensitive muse of childhood innocence was gone forever. Subsequent to his death, and only because the individual involved still held Salinger in great esteem, another story emerged concerning a woman named Jean Miller, who had met Salinger in 1949 in Daytona Beach, Florida, while on vacation when she was only 14. During the vacation, he went for lengthy walks on the beach with her and interacted as if they had known each other for years, her parents too puzzled to even know what to make of such behavior. He immediately began corresponding with her, Miller eventually visiting him in Cornish, but the relationship remained completely platonic until Miller, then 20, made the first move on a trip the two took together to Montreal. Immediately after having sex for the first and only time, Salinger severed the relationship, intimating that his work was so important that he couldn't let anything interfere with that. After a few perfunctory letters, she never heard from him again. Even as she revealed the story, Jean Miller still cherished the memory of this lengthy relationship, but it was quite clear that it also remained a shattering incident in her life. Within a year after dumping Miller, Salinger was involved with his soon-to-be wife Claire, another relationship that resulted in a similar cycle. Claire Salinger eventually extricating herself from her ex-husband geographically, relocating to Southern California. A clinical psychologist and psychotherapist, she eventually published more books than Salinger. Today she still lives in Malibu, California. Salinger eventually married for a third time in 1988 to a former au pair, whose most notable attribute was probably that her last name was O'Neill. J.D. Salinger's legacy might be that he affected the lives of his many readers in a profoundly unique way, but this ability also was evident in those he encountered in his personal life. His first wife, Sylvia Welter, eventually moved to the United States where she practiced as an ophthalmologist. Remarried to an American, she seemed to enjoy a normal life until her death in 2007 in a Hendersonville, North Carolina nursing home. But among her possessions were a vast collection of clippings and information concerning J.D. Salinger, including articles about his relationship with Joyce Maynard. Following Una O'Neill's marriage to Charlie Chaplin, Salinger famously sent her a blistering letter that also included a lewd caricature of her and her husband, intimating that Chaplin would never be anything to her but a fat, impotent old man. Una Chaplin eventually gave birth to 8 of Chaplin's children and remained devoted to the actor for 34 years until Chaplin's death in 1977. Years later, when asked by an interviewer about her relationship with Salinger, she replied, "I have nothing to say about that." Clearly, Salinger himself was greatly affected by his childhood and probably permanently damaged by his experiences in World War II. Perhaps A Catcher in the Rye and Holden Caulfield were merely attempts to hold on to a childhood innocence. Salinger famously said, even to total strangers, that he wished he had never written the book and that it had destroyed his life and his privacy. But A Catcher in the Rye, with the wealth and fame it also brought, allowed Salinger a personal freedom to do in real life exactly what his famous protagonist also attempted to do: refuse to grow up. Thank you for listening to part 2 of this podcast about J.D. Salinger. Information for this podcast came from the books Salinger by Shane Salerno and J.D. Salinger, A Life by Kenneth Slowinski. There are also additional photographs, bibliographical and musical information at someveryfamouspeople.com. Thanks again for listening, and please tell a friend about bite-sized biographies.